By the time the Chicago Ripper crew finally stood before a judge, the worst of the horror was already over. The van wasn't rolling anymore. The attic altar was dark. The L train still rattled overhead, but the city's monster had a name, a face, a file number. What nobody realized was that the legal system was about to carve the story up the same way the crew had carved their victims, piece by piece, uneven, leaving gaps that would never fully heal. Because the law does not speak in ritual and fear. It speaks in charges and counts, in technicalities and terms like eligible for release. And somehow, the man at the center of all of this, the self-appointed prophet who built the cult, who turned mutilation into worship, would never be convicted of a single murder. His followers would carry that weight for him. In our last episode, we were in the interrogation rooms. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, men who had done unspeakable things, now acting like scared kids who'd been caught with a broken window. Edward Spreitzer cracking first, stammering out confession after confession, trying to find the version of the story that would hurt him least. The Coco-Relias brothers, Andrew and Thomas, contradicting each other, contradicting themselves, describing the same rituals in different words, all of it circling one name, Robin Gecht. He was always there in the stories, the one giving orders, the one reading from the Bible, the one holding the knife first. But when the talking stopped and the paperwork began, the system did what it always does. It looked for the cleanest path to a conviction, not necessarily the most complete version of the truth. And that's where this episode lives, in the space between what happened and what the law was willing or able to say about it. The trials were never just about four men. They were about the value of the women they preyed upon. They were about which victim got names in the headlines and which bodies were just case numbers unresolved. They were about what happens when a justice system that already discounts certain lives tries to prosecute a cult that specifically hunted those lives. On one side, you had families who had been living in a kind of open-ended nightmare, birthdays that never came, empty chairs at holidays, phone calls from detectives that always started with, "We're still looking into it." On the other hand, you had defense attorneys and prosecutors wrestling with confession tapes that didn't line up, forensic evidence eaten by time, and a ringleader who refused to crack. The result was a set of sentences that looked, on paper, like justice, and in practice, like a fractured mirror. One man would be executed. One would have his death sentence commuted. One would walk out of prison decades later to a world that did not want him, but had no legal way to keep him. And the man at the center, the, quote, real man, the one that others claimed to worship, would sit on a conviction that stopped just short of murder, buried under decades of rape, kidnapping, and mutilation, but never officially labeled what so many believe he truly was, a serial killer. This isn't the episode where we retell every crime. We've already walked the tracks with Beverly Washington as she fought to live long enough to speak. We sat in the van with Cynthia Smith as she was slashed and thrown back into the night. We've stood in the weeds behind a motel, staring at what was left of Linda Sutton, and tried to understand how anyone could call that ritual. Tonight, we're standing somewhere else. The courtroom, the parole board hearing room, the tiny chapel where a state executioner did his job while a family waited outside for a phone call saying, "It's over." We're going to walk through what happened when the Ripper crew was finally forced to answer for their crimes, who got life, who got death, who got out, and who never carried the legal label that matched his moral guilt. We'll talk about how Illinois politics, death penalty debates, commutations, sentencing reforms reshaped their punishment years after the blood had already dried. We'll talk about legal loopholes and plea bargains, how prosecutors sometimes traded charges like poker chips just to make sure at least something stuck. And we'll talk about the part the court couldn't see, The families who now spend their lives writing impact statements, showing up at parole hearings, measuring time not in years served, but in how many times they had to relive the worst day of their lives just to keep a killer behind bars. This is the final episode of our Chicago Ripper Crew series, the last stop on a road that started with a red van cruising Chicago's streets and ends with a question the law has never fully answered. What does justice look like when evil hides behind everyday faces? When a man can run a crew of ritual killers and still duck murder convictions? When a system designed to be blind to status seems to see victims on a sliding scale? We're going to lay out the sentences side by side. The man who died by lethal injection, the one whose death row became life in a cell, the one who walked out under supervision, and the one who will likely die in prison without ever being called what he really was in court. We're going to look at how these outcomes became possible, not just through the crime scene evidence and legal arguments, but through the quiet math of who society decided was worth fighting for. And when we're done with the paperwork, we're going to do something the system rarely has time for. We're going to give the last word to the women, not to the men who hurt them, not to the lawyers who argued over them, the victims, named and unnamed, who were turned into props in someone else's ritual and then reduced to exhibits in someone else's case file. This is where we hand down our verdict, not just on the crew, but on the system that tried them, punished them, and in some ways failed them. Because in Chicago, in the early 80s, evil wore a work shirt and punched a time card. He smiled at his neighbors. He bounced his kids on his knee. He went to court flanked by attorneys and insisted he was just a husband, a father, a working man caught up in a nightmare someone else created. The law gave him one kind of sentence. History and the families he shattered have given him another. Tonight, we're not chasing the van anymore. We're standing in the courthouse looking back and asking the one question no verdict can really answer. When the rituals are over and the headlines fade, what does justice actually look like for the people left behind? Hey Angela, how's it going tonight?
Hi John, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
Good?
Yeah, I am. I'm good. I had really no complaints whatsoever, so...
I could complain, but that's not what we're here for.
You know, you don't want to complain to the listeners and
Not so much.
see if they'll send you emails telling you what to do with your life?
No, because I don't want to listen to... I don't want to.
I understand. I'm not saying you have to.
I don't want to listen to reason.
I'm not saying that you should. I'm just saying, you know, hey. All right, well, are you ready to jump into this freaking mess? This case sucks. I don't like it at all.
This final episode.
Yes.
Closing the book on
I'll be glad to
vile creatures. Yeah.
I'll be glad to put these freaking animals behind us forever, so... Listeners, you are listening to Dark Dialogue, where we dive into the mysteries that haunt small towns and big cities alike. I'm John, and tonight we've reached the end of a story that is stretched across blood, ritual, manipulation, and fear. The Chicago Ripper Crew isn't just a case of sadism. It's a case of what happens when the justice system is forced to confront evil wearing an ordinary face.
Last episode, we were stuck in the interrogation rooms, confessions unraveling, lies collapsing, and the truth pointing again and again towards the same man, Robin Gecht. Now we're stepping into the courtroom, the parole board, and the years that followed, because catching the killer was only half the battle.
What came next was a legal storm of sentencing, disparities, loopholes, reversals, and outcomes that left families asking the same question for decades. How did the man at the center escape murder convictions while the men who followed him wore that label forever? Angela, I know this episode hits differently. What's going through your mind stepping into the finale?
Honestly, John, the thing that gets me is how uneven everything became once the courts got involved. When we covered the crimes, the brutality was consistent. The pattern was consistent, but once the systems picked it up, it felt like the outcomes depended on politics, timing, confessions, and technicalities, not necessarily on who was the most dangerous. And when you look at the victims' families, some of them had to sit through decades of hearings just to keep these men locked up. Some got closure, some never did. And the one person they believe orchestrated everything, the one everyone pointed at, somehow avoided the label everyone associates with this case.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're going to be unpacking tonight. Not just the sentences, but the why behind them. Why Gex slipped past murder charges. Why one follower was executed, while another walked out of prison 40 years later into a world that didn't want him back. While the system still struggles to decide what justice looks like when the crimes are ritualistic and the testimonies are tangled. Before we get into all that, though, a quick reminder.
As always, if you're watching us on YouTube, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else, follow the show, rate us 5 stars, and leave us a review. It only takes a moment. It's free, but it helps to keep these stories alive and helps us bring more cases and more victims' voices into the light.
And if you'd like to see photos, documents, updates from this series and from any show across the Dark Dialogue Network, you can follow us on social media, or you can check out our website, www.darkdialogue.com. All right. Tonight, we break down the trials, the sentencing, the parole controversies, and the question that still echoes through Chicago's criminal history. I'm your host, John.
And I'm Angela. And this is Dark Dialogue, because the past doesn't stay buried, not in a courtroom, not in a sentencing transcript, and not in the families who've never stopped fighting.
So if you really want to understand how the Ripper Crew cases unfolded, not the myth, not the panic, but the actual way the cases landed inside a courtroom, you start with 1 year, 1983. Everything that would later send 3 men to prison for life and 1 to death row hinged on a pair of decisions made just a few months apart. A single trial in September, a single evidentiary ruling in December. 2 quiet legal moments that decided what the state could prove and what a jury would be allowed to hear. The first of those moments was the start of asshat number 1's trial. That's Robin Gecht for what he did to Beverly Washington.
That's not funny. The asshat part is.
Oh, he's an asshat.
He's an asshat.
King asshat. Not for murder, because the state couldn't make a murder charge stick, which makes no freaking sense to me.
I don't know.
Like any other case, you got like 4 people involved. 3 of them confess and say this dipshit was also there. Mm-hmm. And then you have physical evidence also substantiating the piece of shit was there. In every other case, the piece of shit is tried and convicted for murder.
How is this guy Teflon?
I mean, look at the, look at the Simon Sue murders. Look at, I guess, Charles Manson. I think he got convicted of homicide, but I don't know. It's ludicrous to me. And Manson, regardless, I would have to look. I don't remember off the top of my head what his charges finally were, but he wasn't actually there. I mean, nobody said he was. They said that he told them to go there and do it, but nobody said that he actually was there killing the people.
Right.
In this case, they said that son of a bitch was there.
Leaving his DNA all over the place.
Right. So no recovered breasts traced back to him, no forensic link from his home to any of the bodies, nothing that could take a jury all the way from suspicion to certainty, I guess. But they did have something that the others didn't face, a woman who survived him. Washington had been abducted, drugged, assaulted, mutilated, and dumped near railroad tracks. And she lived. She remembered the van. She remembered the hidden compartment. She remembered the man. And when she had the strength to open her eyes in that hospital room, she identified Robin Gecht. What'd you find out?
Charles Manson was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder in the 1971 Tate LaBianca trial, and an additional 2 counts of first-degree murder in a separate trial for other victims, according to Google.
So, yeah, I mean, he was never even accused of being in the Tate house. According to testimony, he did go into the LaBiancas and tie them up
Mm-hmm.
and then sent the others in there to kill them. But case in point.
Yeah.
You know, he was convicted of
convicted on
first-degree murder.
Well, 7, 8, 9, yeah.
So, I don't know. It's freaking nuts. It's Illinois. Sorry to my Illinois listeners, but this is absolute insanity.
Yeah.
And this case
Well, each
is
state
bullshit.
is different.
So, yeah, I don't know. But prosecutors built the case that they could build, not the case everyone suspected was hiding behind it. They charged him only with the counts connected to Washington: attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, rape, deviant sexual assault, aggravated battery, armed violence. They kept the murders in the background as implication, not indictment, because they knew better than to gamble a homicide trial with no forensic hook. The irony is that this narrow case, the one that wasn't about the killings at all, would become the foundation of everything that followed. But before any juror heard a word of testimony, the court had to decide if Gecht was even competent to stand trial. On March 2nd, the judge ruled that he was. No mental illness dodge, no diversion into a psychiatric hospital. He was fit, aware, and responsible for his own defense. The ruling cleared the path for a full public trial, and it shut down any attempt at painting him as too mentally fractured to understand the charges against him. Pretrial motions were a fight over the shape of the narrative. Prosecutors pushed to include evidence of similar mutilation attacks, other women, other wounds, other nights that all looked eerily similar to Washington's. The defense tried to shut all of it down, arguing that it would turn a single assault case into a sensationalized mass murder circus. And to the judge's credit, he tried to walk a tightrope, allow enough similarity evidence to show identity and intent, but avoid letting the Washington trial become a proxy trial for every mutilated body found in Cook County. Then September arrived, and on September the 20th, 1983, the trial opened. In the state's telling, Washington got into the van as a paying date and met the real Gecht only after the doors slammed shut. The gun, the pills, the restraints, the walled-off compartment in the back, the sexual assault, the cutting, the mutilation, the dumping. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. The facts carried their own gravity. They leaned into the idea that Gecht was the ringleader of something much bigger, but they reminded the jury that their job, legally, was focused on this one attack. The defense fought that narrative with everything they had. They painted Gecht as a convenient villain, a man whose old association, maybe, with John Wayne Gacy made him irresistible to police and the media. And, you know, like I said in that episode, I don't believe the dude had anything to do with freaking Gacy, but whatever. They argued that Washington's identification came through trauma, pain medication, and exposure to photos that primed her to choose him. They pointed out over and over that the state had no physical forensic evidence tying Gecht to any murder scene, and they tried to flatten the entire Ripper Crew idea into police desperation and rumor. And I gotta say, it's too bad that DNA didn't exist then, because they could have hung this shit, all of it, on this bastard.
I know.
But the prosecution had something more powerful than a theory. They had Washington on the stand. She described the van, the hidden compartment, the restraints, the cutting instrument. The moment she realized that she wasn't going to get out of that vehicle alive, doctors backed her up with medical records, near fatal blood loss, breast removal, slash marks that matched her story detail for detail. Police testified about the scene where she was found, naked, bleeding, dumped like trash by the railroad tracks. Every piece of testimony brought the jury one step closer to something the defense could not erase. Then came the moment nobody expected. Gecht took the stand himself. It is extremely rare for a defendant in a case like this to testify, but this asshat did. He admitted involvement. He denied leadership. He denied cult activity. He denied murder. He said the van wasn't a torture chamber, and he tried to shrink his role down to something that still wasn't innocent, but Maybe it wasn't monstrous either. His lawyers hammered the same points: questionable identification, no forensics, sensational press, and a narrative inflated beyond the evidence. And while Gecht was trying to separate himself from the other three men, something else was happening in a DuPage County courtroom that would decide their fate. Because while Cook County was wrapping up Gecht's trial, prosecutors in DuPage were preparing for Thomas Cocorielis's upcoming murder trial in the death of Lori Borowski. And Thomas's defense team was trying to suppress the very thing that would later define the entire Ripper Crew story: his confessions. Multiple statements, multiple days, multiple agencies, the kind of detail that made police believe he knew things only a participant could know. The locations, the wounds, the rituals, the breast amputations, the so-called chapel in Gecht's home where women were tortured and killed. But Thomas said that he was beaten, he was threatened. The detectives staged a mock execution in the Schiller Woods by forcing him to dig and making him think he was about to die. The police fed him information, and he just repeated what they wanted to hear. The prosecution insisted that he was not coerced. They said the details were too specific, too consistent, too accurate to be fed. They argued his statements matched non-public information, things no outsider could ever possibly guess. And on December 4th, 1983, the judge ruled that Thomas's confessions would be admissible in trial. That ruling did more than determine what a jury would hear. It set the tone for the entire series of prosecutions, because with that ruling, the courts effectively said, these confessions count. They can be used. They're voluntary. They're reliable enough. And once that door opened, the state walked right through it, using those statements to prosecute Thomas, Andrew, and Spitzer for the homicides they never would have been able to prove through physical evidence alone. So by the time 1983 ended, the strategy for all four men was locked in place. Gecht would be taken down through the one woman who had lived. The others would be prosecuted through their own words, the confessions, the patterns, the ritualistic wounds, the story they told in interrogation rooms that would follow them for the rest of their lives. For better or worse, this was the moment when the courts decided what they were willing to believe. And everything that came later, every conviction, every death sentence, every appeal, grew from the seeds planted in that single year. And I just got to say, I hope to hell that whatever was at play in Illinois in the 1980s, I hope they got rid of this shit, because frankly, if you have to rely on a defendant to confess in order to be able to convict them, then you might as well just give up murder trials altogether. This is lunacy. So by the time 1984 arrived, the Ripper Crew cases had shifted from possibility to inevitability. The courts had made their decisions in 83. What evidence would come in? What confessions would stand? How far prosecutors could push the pattern? And now the question wasn't whether these men would go down, but how, and for what, and for how long. It was the year each of them stepped into a courtroom and found out exactly what the state intended to do with them. For Robin Gecht, 1984 began with the door slamming shut, hard. In February, he stood in front of Judge Francis Mahan to be sentenced for what he did to Beverly Washington. The jury had already convicted him on every count tied to her attack. All that remained was the number. This wasn't a quiet sentencing. Mahan flat out called him the devil. He said the mutilation was so deliberate, so controlled, that if Washington hadn't lived long enough to identify him, Gecht would be standing there on murder charges instead of attempted murder, unless he didn't confess, Illinois. Judges don't usually editorialize, not like that. But Mahan wanted it on the record. This was not a man who got carried away or lost control or acted on impulse. This was someone who did exactly what he meant to do. And then the judge did something rare. He built the sentence like he was stacking bricks, one on top of the other, until the wall reached to the ceiling. 60 years for attempted murder, 60 years for rape, 60 years for deviant sexual assault, 30 more for kidnapping, some concurrent, one consecutive, a structure designed to make sure the total wasn't symbolic. It was 120 years, a number meant to erase the possibility of ever seeing freedom again. What made it unforgettable was that Gecht had never been convicted of a single homicide, not one. And yet, this single sentencing hearing, just Beverly Washington's case, effectively took him off the board for the rest of his life. Hallelujah, thank God. That left the murders for the other three, and one of them was about to take a shortcut. Edward Spreitzer had watched Gecht's trial. He'd watched Thomas fight the admissibility battle, watched the state get ready to bring him into court on 4 different homicide indictments. He knew what was coming.
Did you let him watch the trial?
Well, I mean, not actually watch the trial.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, I was
essentially sitting in a
very
cell.
literal there for a minute. I was like, what?
Yeah, no, this was really before televised hearings, and they didn't take him to the courtroom. So, but I mean, he knew what the hell was going on.
Okay,
Right.
I was just way too literal.
So he also knew what Thomas's confessions contained: his own name, his own actions, his own presence at scene after scene. Spreitzer wasn't dumb. He knew that if every one of those cases went to trial, he'd be staring down the death penalty 4 separate times. So on April 2nd, 1984, he walked into a Cook County courtroom and did something none of the others had done yet. He pled guilty. 4 murders: Rose Davis, Sandra Delaware, Shui Mock, and Rafael Tirado, all swallowed in a single plea, all 4 carrying life terms. And attached to those murders were things everyone whispered about but rarely said out loud: the abductions, the sexual assaults, the mutilation, the torture. The deal kept him off of death row for those Cook County cases, but it also planted a seed that would come back later, because once he admitted to 4 murders, once those convictions were on the books, they became the ammunition that the state needed in DuPage County to argue that he met the multiple murder aggravator. His plea didn't just end 4 cases. It loaded the gun for his future death sentencing hearing in the murder of Linda Sutton. Spreitzer closed the door behind him without realizing that he'd just opened another. While those pieces were locking into place, another battle was underway, one that would decide the fate of the youngest member of the group. Thomas Coco Rielis went on trial in DuPage County for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of 21-year-old Lorraine Lori Borowski. A daylight abduction, not an alley, not a dark street, broad freaking daylight. On her way to unlock the real estate office where she worked, her keys were found right outside the door. Her body was found later, partially clothed, stabbed so many times that pathologists struggled to count each wound with precision. In the center of the prosecution's case, the thing everything else hung on, was the confession the court had ruled admissible just a few months earlier. The jury heard Thomas's words: how he and Spreitzer spotted Borowski walking toward the office, how they forced her into a vehicle, how they drove her to a secluded area, how they assaulted her, stabbed her, and left her in a field. They heard details that matched the autopsy, details that matched the dump site, details that matched the injuries. But the jury also heard Thomas recant every bit of it. He told them that the police beat him, that they threatened to kill him, that in the middle of the Schiller Woods, detectives forced him to dig his own grave as part of a staged execution meant to terrify him into talking. He said officers fed him details, the wounds, the order of events, the location, and he simply repeated whatever they wanted to hear. He said nothing he told them was voluntary. And I gotta say, if we're talking about like Jesse Miskelly in the West Memphis 3 case or something,
That's what it sounded like.
You can make an argument, but for this piece of shit, you can't make any freaking arguments. He knew shit nobody could have possibly known, because he knew shit that the cops hadn't discovered yet. You know, he knew about like the breasts in the box in the attic and shit like
15
that.
of them.
I mean, yeah, it is not comparable to coerced confessions. So the state countered with the familiar refrain that he provided information no outsider could know. Details never made public, multiple statements given on multiple days to multiple officers. The detectives denied laying a hand on him, and in the end, after hearing every word of that fight, the jury believed the prosecution. On May 18, 1984, they convicted him. Murder, rape, aggravated kidnapping, and just like that, Thomas became the third member of the crew with a murder conviction on his record. Only one question remained. What would his punishment be? Illinois prosecutors pushed hard for the death penalty. They argued this murder was part of a pattern, part of a series of crimes more sadistic than anything the country had seen in decades. But the judge didn't give them death. Not yet. Not for his first conviction. On September 7, 1984, Thomas Coco Rieles was sentenced to life imprisonment for killing Lori Borowski. Life for the murder, additional terms for the rape and kidnapping, but the life term swallowed everything else. He left the courtroom that day with the same legal certainty as Gecht and Spreitzer. He wasn't going home again. And here's the thing that no one knew yet. The sentence wouldn't be the last. An appellate court would later overturn the conviction because jurors never heard certain co-defendant statements that may have helped this dipshit defend himself. And rather than risk a retrial that put him back in front of a capital jury, he would plead out years later for a single 70-year term. But in 1984, in the moment we're living in right now, the story looks simple. Gecht was buried under 120 years. Spreitzer had locked in 4 murder convictions, and Thomas had been handed life for Lori Borowski. 3 men, 3 different paths, all leading to the same place, the rest of their lives behind bars. And by the end of 1984, only one member of the crew had not yet faced a homicide sentencing, Andrew Coco Rieles. But that reckoning was not far behind. In February and March of 1985, the state finally put Andrew Coco Rieles through his first full homicide trial. The case they chose was the murder of 30-year-old Roseback Davis, and by the time the verdict and sentence were in, you could see the blueprint the prosecution was going to use on the Ripper crew over and over again. Build everything around detailed confessions, back it up with medical and crime scene evidence, bring in other murders to show a serial pattern, and then reach for the harshest punishment the law would allow. The Davis case was brutal, even by Ripper Crew standards. Rose was a married woman from Chicago. On September 8, 1982, her nude, mutilated body was found in a narrow gangway off North Lakeshore Drive. She hadn't just been killed. She'd been beaten, stabbed, sexually assaulted, and desecrated. At autopsy, the pathologist documented multiple stab wounds, deep cuts across her breasts, and a 4-inch piece of wood forced into her vagina. Those details weren't background color. They were the core of the torture, sexual sadism narrative the state leaned into when they walked the jury through what happened to this poor woman. The trial opened on February 6, 1985 in Cook County. In his opening statement, Assistant State's Attorney Joel Goldstein told jurors that Andrew and co-offender Edward Spreitzer took Davis off the street and into a van. He said they gagged her, handcuffed her, raped her, and then stabbed her and mutilated her before dumping her in the gangway. He described Rose as a woman who, quote, died without dignity. And that phrase became a kind of theme for the prosecution. This wasn't a split-second street killing. This was deliberate, extended cruelty. The state built the case around Andrew's own words. Detectives, an assistant state's attorney, and a court reporter all took the stand and described his confessions. In those statements, Andrew said that he, Robin Gecht, and Spreitzer spotted Davis walking alone, forced her into their van, raped her, and stabbed her with a kitchen knife. He went beyond Rose's case and claimed that he had participated in as many as 15 to 16 similar murders. Jeez. That number mattered. It didn't just place him at one scene. It put him right in the center of a string of attacks that investigators were already treating as a serial pattern. Over repeated defense objections, the judge allowed other crimes evidence to come in. Jurors heard that Andrew had admitted involvement in other mutilation murders, including those of Linda Sutton and Shui Mock. The state's argument was simple. They weren't trying to tell the jury that he was a bad man in general. They were trying to show identity, intent, and a distinctive way of operating. Women grabbed into vehicles, group sexual assaults, stab wounds, breast-centered injuries, bodies left in places that said, this person doesn't even deserve a decent resting place. Medical and crime scene witnesses gave the Davis case its physical weight. They described Rose's multiple stab wounds, the injuries to her breasts, the piece of wood inserted into her body, and the evidence of sexual assault. Their testimony lined up with the core features of Andrew's confessions. The prosecution didn't have to rely on his words alone. They could point to the body and say, this is exactly what he described. When it was Andrew's turn, he took the stand and tried to pull it all back. He told the jury that police had coerced him, that he'd been pressured and abused into confessing to the things that he didn't do. But on cross-examination, he admitted that he told officers about participating in 16 murders before he said any beating began. The state hammered that point. If he was already describing a string of killings before the alleged physical abuse, how much of his story could really be blamed on coercion? On February 11, 1985, after a relatively short deliberation, the jury came back with their answer. They found Andrew Asshat Coco Relays guilty of the murder of Rose Beck Davis, of raping her, and of aggravated kidnapping. In their view, his confessions, combined with the medical and crime scene evidence and the other crimes testimony, were enough to prove his role in her abduction, sexual assault, and killing beyond any reasonable doubt. That moved the case into the next phase, punishment. At sentencing, prosecutors went straight for death. They argued that Davis's abduction, rape, and multiple stab wounds and sexualized mutilation put this crime among the worst that Cook County had ever seen. They reminded the court and the jury that Andrew himself had admitted to multiple other killings with Geck, Spreitzer, and his dipshit brother Thomas. They wanted the Davis case to stand as the one that took him off the map permanently. The jury wasn't unanimous. In the capital phase, they deadlocked. News coverage from the time makes it clear they could not all agree to impose the death penalty, and without unanimity...
There's a word.
There is a word.
Yeah.
And without unanimity, the court was barred from sentencing him to die. So the final decision fell to the judge. On March 18, 1985, the trial judge sentenced Andrew to natural life imprisonment for the murder of Rose Beck Davis. On top of that, he imposed an extended term 60-year sentence for rape and an extended term 30-year sentence for aggravated kidnapping. Later, the Illinois Appellate Court would step in and reduce those extended terms, cutting the rape sentence down to 30 years and the aggravated kidnapping sentence to 15. But the life term stood. And that's the key point for where we are in this arc. Before DuPage County ever put him on trial for the Lorraine Borowski case, before there was any talk of a death sentence out there, Cook County had already locked Andrew into spending the rest of his life in prison for what happened to Rose Beck Davis. 1985 didn't just convict him, it froze his future. It showed in a single trial exactly how the state planned to deal with the Ripper Crew. So by 1986, the legal landscape around the Ripper Crew shifted in two dramatic different directions. In one DuPage County courtroom, prosecutors pushed Edward Spreitzer from a man already buried under multiple life sentences into a condemned defendant, arguing that the murder of Linda Sutton was so brutal, so deliberate, and so consistent with his other killings that nothing short of death would do. In another courtroom, an appellate panel was tearing open the conviction of Thomas Coco Relays in the Lorraine Borowski case, exposing how fragile the state's reliance on interlocking confessions really was. Put together, The year revealed just how heavily these prosecutions leaned on statements, who gave them, who recanted them, and which ones juries were allowed to hear. Spreitzer's 1986 Sutton trial began on February the 25th. By then, he had already pleaded guilty in Cook County to 4 murders: Rose Davis, Sandra Delaware, Shui Mock, and Rosario Torrado, and was serving life terms. But DuPage County, it wanted its own reckoning for what had been done to 21-year-old Linda Sutton. Spreitzer waived a jury for the guilt phase, leaving Judge Edward Cowell alone to hear the case. The state laid out the core sequence. Sutton, last seen around 11 p.m. on May 23, 1981, vanished into the orbit of the same people who had been preying on women across Chicago. About a week later, her body was found discarded in a field east of the Brer Rabbit Motel in Villa Park. Hands cuffed behind her, partially nude, stabbed repeatedly in the chest, and with both breasts removed. The prosecution argued that Spreitzer, Gecht, and the other dipshits picked her up in Chicago, drove her to the motel area, dragged her into the bushes, tortured her, mutilated her, and left her to die alone in the woods. The center of the trial was Spreitzer's own November 1982 statements. Detectives and an assistant state's attorney testified that he described taking Sutton in a van with Gecht, driving her to Villa Park, and participating in her mutilation. In one account, he said Gecht severed a breast with a wire-type device and assaulted the wound while she screamed. The other, he said that on Gecht's orders, he used electrical wire from the van to remove the second breast, and that he briefly penetrated the chest cavity. When Spreitzer took the stand, he admitted that the November 5th statement, where he described his role in the mutilation, was accurate. But he tried to retreat from the broader November 8th confession, casting himself as a psychologically dependent follower, operating under Gecht's domination, not a sadist in his own right. Judge Cowell didn't buy it. He credited the state's version of events, finding that Sutton's death resulted from multiple stab wounds inflicted during the abduction and torture. On March 4th, he issued a bench verdict of guilty on both murder and aggravated kidnapping. When the judge read his findings, DuPage County shifted immediately into capital mode. Even with 4 previous life terms already locked into place, prosecutors saw the Sutton case as the one that demanded death. Spreitzer elected to have a jury decide his sentence. That sentence hearing opened with a simple but devastating eligibility argument. Under Illinois law, a defendant could receive death if convicted on multiple murders. The state introduced the certified Sutton conviction and formal judgments from Cook County documenting the 4 previous murders Spreitzer had admitted in his 1984 plea bargain. That was more than enough for the jury to find the statutory aggravators satisfied. The case then moved into aggravation and mitigation, one side portraying Spreitzer as a sadistic serial predator whose crimes involved abduction, sexual assault, mutilation, and disposal. The other trying to frame him as an immature, psychologically dependent young man under Gecht's control. After weighing both sides, the jury concluded there were no mitigating factors strong enough to block execution. On March the 20th, they handed down a death verdict, and the judge imposed a death sentence for Sutton's murder along with a lengthy prison term for the kidnapping count. While all of this was unfolding in DuPage County, another part of the Ripper Crew legal structure was weakening. Thomas Coco Reyes' earlier conviction for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Lorraine Lori Borowski was being dismantled on appeal. Thomas had originally been convicted by a jury after giving detailed confessions describing how Borowski was grabbed outside her Elmhurst real estate office, taken to an isolated spot, sexually assaulted, stabbed, and left in a field. But his appellate lawyers argued that the trial court had made a critical evidentiary mistake. It had blocked the jury from hearing limited, properly redacted statements from co-defendants, statements that, in certain places, shifted blame away from Thomas or suggested that others played more dominant roles in Borowski's murder. I don't give a shit. I don't give two shits. I don't care who did what. You are both there.
Yeah.
Hang both the bastards.
Exactly.
All four of them. The appellate judge agreed. They ruled that the trial court had erred by excluding those statements entirely. Under Illinois law, a defendant was entitled to present exculpatory portions of a co-defendant's confession as long as it was redacted to avoid confrontation problems. Because the right was violated, Thomas's conviction and sentence were vacated. He didn't walk out of prison, but DuPage prosecutors were suddenly forced to reconsider their entire approach. If they retried him, they would have to do it under tighter evidentiary rules, with jurors not allowed to see parts of statements that made Thomas look less central, or at least less uniquely culpable than the prosecution had originally portrayed him. In the end, faced with the uncertainties of a second capital-eligible trial and the growing public scrutiny of the Ripper Crew cases, DuPage County cut a deal. Instead of taking Thomas back before a death-qualified jury, they secured a plea that resulted in a 70-year sentence. It kept him in prison for decades without risking another appellate collapse. For the Ripper Crew as a whole, 1986 revealed a paradox. In one courtroom, the state's reliance on confessions and prior murders made a death sentence feel almost inevitable. In another, that same reliance cracked a major conviction wide open. It was the year the system proved how powerful those confession-based prosecutions could be and how vulnerable. By 1987, DuPage County was closing out the Ripper Crew prosecutions with a level of force and finality the earlier Cook County cases hadn't quite achieved. This is the year the system split the Coco Relias brothers permanently. Andrew was driven through a full capital trial for the murder of Lorraine Lori Borowski and sentenced to die, while Thomas, whose own Borowski conviction had collapsed on appeal, accepted a plea that locked him in decades of imprisonment without risking a second death penalty fight. When the dust settled, Andrew was on death row and Thomas had taken a 70-year deal, ending any remaining uncertainty about how DuPage County intended to deal with the Borowski case. Andrew's second Borowski trial opened with a clear state narrative. Borowski disappeared on May 15, 1982, while opening the Elmhurst real estate office where she worked. Her keys were found outside the locked door. Her body surfaced later near Clarendon Hills Cemetery, stabbed repeatedly, sexually assaulted, and showing signs of prolonged terror. Prosecutors told jurors that Andrew and Edward Spreitzer had seen her walking, forced her into a van, driven her to the cemetery area, beaten and stabbed her, and dumped her body in the weeds. Detectives described a pair of November 1982 confessions, one oral, one handwritten, where Andrew laid out the sequence almost step by step, cruising with Spreitzer, grabbing Borowski, driving to a secluded spot, and stabbing her until she stopped screaming. When he took the stand, he recanted and insisted that police had beaten him, but officers countered that he revealed non-public details only the killer would know. The court allowed the state to introduce evidence from other murders, especially the killings of Linda Sutton and Shui Mock, to emphasize a pattern: abductions in vehicles, sexual assaults involving mutilation or extreme violence, and bodies dumped in isolated or overgrown locations. For jurors, the similarities between those cases and Borowski's seemed to erase the notion that this was a one-time aberration. On March 18, 1987, they delivered guilty verdicts for murder and aggravated kidnapping, accepting the confessions, the corroborating evidence, and the pattern testimony as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That verdict pushed the case straight into capital territory. At the eligibility phase of sentencing, the state established that Andrew was over 18 at the time of the crime and had already been convicted of another murder, the killing of Rosebeck Davis, triggering Illinois' multiple murder aggravator. The jury found him eligible for death and proceeded into the final aggravation mitigation weighing. Prosecutors stressed the brutality of Borowski's murder, a broad daylight abduction, rape, more than 80 stab wounds, and a body left in a cemetery like refuse. They reminded the jury that another court had already sentenced him to natural life for Davis's torture murder, and they emphasized his role in the broader sequence of mutilation killings tied to the Ripper crew. The defense countered by describing Andrew as 19 at the time, intellectually a dumbass, and dominated psychologically by older leader Robin Gecht. No?
No, I didn't.
Oh, it just pisses me off. Like, I don't give a shit how damn dumb you are.
Yeah.
I don't care. Like, when it comes to coerced confessions, like with Jesse Miskelly, there's a bunch of them out there. Then you can make that argument that they could admit something that they didn't actually do. But to say, well, they're too damn stupid not to kill people.
Right.
Well, I don't give a shit. That just means that just means we need to get rid of them. They can't live in society. I don't give a shit what the reason is that you are out raping, murdering, and mutilating women to an extent you seldom even hear of. Yeah. I don't give a shit what the reason is. You need to go away. You need to be out of society forever, whether we kill you, whether we lock you away. I don't give a shit either way. Yeah. But you need to go away forever. Anyway, sorry.
I don't disagree.
But he was too stupid, and he was dominated psychologically by the older leader, Robin Gecht, more follower than architect, more pliable than predatory. But the jury wasn't persuaded. They thought like me. They concluded that no mitigating factor outweighed the aggravating circumstances. And on April the 30th, 1987, Judge Edward Cowell sentenced Andrew to death, with a separate term for aggravated kidnapping layered beneath it. The Illinois Supreme Court later affirmed the sentence, and Andrew was executed in 1999.
Really?
Really. So by the end of 1987, DuPage County had achieved what prosecutors had been building toward since the first confession surfaced in 1982. A capital sentence against Andrew for the Borowski murder, and a long, determinate term against Thomas that avoided the uncertainties of retrial. The brothers, once co-defendants in overlapping cases, now stood at opposite ends of the penal spectrum. One headed to death row, the other sealed into decades of imprisonment, marking the final legal separation of their paths in the Ripper Crew prosecutions. Fast forward a little bit. On March the 17th, 1999, at a little after midnight, Andrew Coco Relias became the final person executed in the state of Illinois. His death by lethal injection at the Toms Correctional Center marked the end of a prosecution arc that had begun 17 years earlier with the abduction, rape, mutilation, and murder of 21-year-old Lorraine Lori Borowski. It also marked the end of capital punishment in the state as it had existed for decades. What unfolded that night was not simply the conclusion of the Coco Relias case. It was the final chapter of Illinois' modern death penalty. In the months leading up to the execution, Andrew's attorneys had exhausted nearly every avenue of appeal. They argued that his earlier natural life sentence in the Rosebeck Davis case should have barred a later death sentence, and they raised the broader concerns about the reliability of Illinois' capital system, a system that had been shaken repeatedly by overturned verdicts and exonerations. On the day of the execution, a brief spark of hope flickered when Illinois Supreme Court Justice Moses Harrison II issued a temporary stay, but the full court dissolved it within hours, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined further review. With all judicial doors closed, the final decision fell to Governor George Ryan. Ryan publicly struggled with the case. He had supported the death penalty for years, but Illinois' mounting record of wrongful convictions lingered heavily over his administration. Even so, late on the night of March 16th, he denied clemency, stating that Borowski's murder was so brutal and the evidence of Andrew's guilt was so strong that he would not intervene. He acknowledged the failings of the system, but concluded that certain crimes remained within the moral bounds of the ultimate punishment. Hours later, the state of Illinois prepared for what would become its last execution. Andrew was moved by helicopter to the Supermax Tom's Correctional Center, where Illinois had built an execution chamber specifically for lethal injection. In the final days, officials reported that he refused solid food and drank only water. He read from the Bible and visited with at least one of his brothers. His demeanor in those final hours was described as quiet, resigned, almost inwardly focused, a stark contrast to the violent histories that had brought him there. Shortly after midnight, he was led into the execution chamber and secured to the gurney. Witnesses later said that he sighed several times, licked his lips, and seemed to whisper faintly before the drugs took him. At approximately 12:30 a.m. on March 17, 1999, he was pronounced dead. He was 35 years old. And with that pronouncement, the state of Illinois carried out its 12th execution since the reinstatement of capital punishment, and its last.
I want to know what he said.
Happy St. Patrick's Day? That's what I would have said. Son of a bitch. Sorry, I have no sympathy for these animals. I would dance like a freaking leprechaun on this piece of shit's grave today, right now. I think it's hilarious that he was executed on St. Patrick's Day. I think it's awesome.
I mean, it's lucky for some.
It's lucky for the rest of the world.
Lucky for the rest of the world. But I want to know what he said. They shouldn't tell us that they seem to have said something if they don't know what it was.
You know, I mean, I think it's great. The dude, maybe he found God. Maybe he made things right. And if you're a believer, maybe he made his way through the pearly gates and all that's wonderful. I could give two shits. I don't care.
Right.
I care about all of the women. I mean, whether you believe in the death penalty or you don't believe in the death penalty, you're going to have a hard, really, really hard time arguing against it with this group of freaking animals.
No.
I don't know that I could find a more depraved, disgusting, evil case to talk about.
Right.
I don't even know if it's out there. I don't think that.
And I hope it never becomes out there.
Oh, hell no. But, I don't think that we do I guarantee if we do a Charlie Manson episode, it would not compare to this. Neither would Ted Bundy's. I mean, Ed Kemper's. I could go on and on. Richard Ramirez. I mean, maybe like the Toy Box Killers, the sadistic freaking ugly son of a bitch that killed the Zawalskis. Anyway, but the number of killers that torture, that get off on extending torture for as long as they can.
Literally.
Like people like that, I don't give a shit what happens to them.
Yeah.
I really do not. Anyway, in the years around Andrew's execution, cracks in the foundation of Illinois' death penalty widened dramatically. 13 men would eventually be exonerated from death row, and investigative work across the state exposed systemic failures, from coerced confessions to flawed forensics to prosecutorial misconduct. These revelations reshaped the public's understanding of capital punishment in Illinois and placed Andrew's execution within a broader reckoning about the risk of irreversible error. Less than a year later, and I just got to say,
it's not funny, but your reactions are.
I mean, okay, I can get on board with that argument. I can get on board with the fact that the death penalty is final, and if we don't know that we got it right, we shouldn't. And the false confessions and all that kind of horse shit, whatever. I can get on board with that. And if we want to say we're not going to kill people in this country anymore, we're going to do away with the death penalty for everyone, always. Because what if we kill an innocent man? What if we kill an innocent woman? I can get on board with that shit because I don't want to kill somebody that didn't commit the crime.
Right.
But I want it to go the other way as well. I want what happens when you release a freaking pedophile that then goes out and murders babies? What happens when you release a rapist that then goes on to become a serial killer?
Yeah.
I mean, this shit works. You say, an irreversible punishment. Well, what about an irreversible clemency? You turn these son of a bitches out and then they go murder somebody. That's irreversible too.
Yeah. And preventable.
And very preventable.
Mm-hmm.
The big difference is we know that those bastards are criminals, rapists, child molesters. I mean, I can go on and on about sex crimes because there is no rehabilitation for these sick sons of bitches. They're going to reoffend. We know they're going to reoffend. And how do I know that we know? Because we make them register so we can find them when they reoffend. Because the recidivism rate within sexual predators is like 99%.
Mm-hmm.
No, don't quote me, but it's freaking up there. And so I can
quoting you right now.
I can get on board, like I said, with doing away with the death penalty. But on the other side of the coin, I want these bastards locked away in prison for the rest of their lives. And as we go through the rest of this episode and we learn that one of these son of a bitches is walking the streets right now, well, that's not okay either. That's on the other end of the spectrum of not freaking okay. But I will say, I have no problems with Andrew dying. I do have a problem with Andrew being the only one that we killed.
Yeah.
Anyway, less than a year later.
I love you. Anyway.
Less than a year later, on January 31st, 2000, Governor Ryan declared a moratorium on executions, citing the unacceptable possibility of killing innocent people. That moratorium remained in place until 2011, when Governor Pat Quinn signed legislation formally abolishing the death penalty and commuted all remaining death sentences to life without parole. In the sweeping arc from reinstatement to the Coco Relays execution to the moratorium and the eventual abolition, Andrew's death stands as a fixed point. It marked the end of one of the state's most notorious serial murder prosecutions, and more profoundly, the last time Illinois exercised its authority to kill in the name of justice. And I will just say, you couldn't have picked a better son of a bitch to be the last one, because in my mind, all four of these freaking animals should be dead.
Robin could have been better.
Well, this is true. Yes. Okay, moving on. In January of 2003, as he prepared to leave office, Illinois Governor George Ryan made one of the most sweeping and controversial criminal justice decisions in the state's history. With a single action, a blanket clemency order covering every condemned prisoner in Illinois. He dismantled the death row that had defined the state's justice system for decades, and in that mass commutation, one name carried particular weight for the Ripper Crew cases: Edward Spreitzer. His death sentence for the murder of Linda Sutton became life without parole, transforming him from a condemned man awaiting execution into another permanent inmate in a system Ryan had declared too broken to trust with life and death decisions. On January 11th and 12th, Ryan stood before Illinois and laid out a devastating indictment of the state's capital apparatus. He cited reversals, wrongful convictions, coerced confessions, systemic errors, and a level of arbitrariness that, in his words, made it impossible to, quote, tinker with the machinery of death, end quote. The clemency list released to the public carried the names of over 160 condemned prisoners. Among them was Spreitzer, Edward. His sentence, death for the abduction, torture, mutilation, and murder of 21-year-old Linda Sutton, was converted to life imprisonment. No execution date would ever again hang over his head. For Spreitzer, Ryan's order didn't offer anything resembling freedom. By 2003, he was already serving 4 Cook County life sentences for earlier murders. The DuPage County death sentence for Sutton had simply placed him in a separate track from his co-defendants, one that would have ended in lethal injection had Ryan not intervened. The commutation closed the final door on that trajectory. He would remain exactly where he had been since the 1980s, a man serving stacked life terms destined to die behind prison walls. The impact of Ryan's decision rippled through every Ripper Crew outcome. It froze the group's remaining legal landscape into its final form. Andrew Coco Relias had been executed in 1999, becoming the last person put to death in Illinois history. Robin Gecht remained in the Department of Corrections under a 120-year sentence for the assault of Beverly, Washington. Thomas Coco Relias stayed under the 70-year term that he'd accepted in exchange for avoiding a retrial and potential death sentence. And with Ryan's pen, Spreitzer, once the only surviving member of the group under a capital sentence, joined the same permanent custody tier as the others. Ryan's order did not distinguish between the innocent and the guilty, between compelling claims of wrongful conviction and cases like Spreitzer's, where even appellate courts describe their brutality in language rarely seen in judicial opinions. The governor argued that the system's failings were too deep, too structural, and too unpredictable to separate one case from another. A broken system, he said, could not be trusted to kill only the right people, and so he refused to let it kill anyone. And I just got to say, I don't really give a shit what states decide to do what. I don't care. Wyoming, I sure as a shit can't say that we got it right. We haven't killed anybody for freaking ages. Mm-hmm. But I think it should be, I don't think a governor should have the authority to dismantle a penalty that was enacted by the legislature.
Is that not why there are teams of people that do checks and balances and such?
Well, that's why we have three branches of government.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I mean, I'm all on board with a governor having the ability to offer clemency to a death row inmate, because you really have to have that decision be held by like that one last person. Mm-hmm. If that's what the law says, then I'm all on board with it. But I do not like any executive being able to dismantle the law of a state or of a country. I don't give a shit if it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump. I don't want them to be able to, with a swipe of a pen, change legislation. It's not designed to work that way. Yeah. It should not work that way. If Illinois wants to do away with the death penalty, if Wyoming wants to do it, if any state wants to do away with the death penalty, the legislature should draft legislation, vote on it. It should be passed in the House, ratified in the Senate, and then sent on to the executive to be signed into law. And then it's official. The idea that a governor can do this shit pisses me off. Anyway, I'm pissed off tonight. This case pisses me off.
And thank you for coming to John's TED Talk.
Exactly. So by the time Ryan left office, Illinois' death row no longer existed. What remained were life terms, dozens of them, replacing sentences once intended to end in execution chambers at Tom's. For the Ripper Crew, it meant the final chapter had been written. No more death hearings, no more appeals addressing capital eligibility, no more looming execution dates, just a collection of permanent sentences, each representing one piece of a sprawling and devastating series of crimes. From that moment on, the legal history of the Ripper Crew would no longer be measured in terms of death sentences, but in the permanence of incarceration. Ryan's decision reshaped the entire arc of the case, cementing Andrew as the last person Illinois would ever execute, unless they change it, and leaving Edward Spreitzer to live out his days under the weight of multiple life sentences in a system that had finally abandoned the power to take his life. And then, just when you think you're done with these asshats, on March 29th, 2019, in the quiet mid-morning hours at the Illinois River Correctional Center in Canton, the unthinkable happened.
Don't say it.
Thomas Asshat Coco Relias walked out of prison. He was 58 years old. 50 freaking 8 years old. Still way young enough to kill people. Mm-hmm. The same man once indicted as part of one of the most sadistic murder groups in Illinois, and I would say in American history, convicted in the abduction, rape, and killing of a 21-year-old Lorraine Lori Borowski, stepped into the free world after the state determined that he had legally served the maximum time required on his 70-year sentence. There were no...
How?
Yeah.
How is there maximum time required?
In a
If the sentence is
it's 7 years, not the maximum freaking time.
time required. Oh gosh.
Oh, yeah. You think the same way I do. Like, if you don't want a son of a bitch to spend 70 years in prison, sends him to 30.
Exactly.
But this bullshit of turning these assholes out just, ugh.
And good behavior pisses me off too.
Yeah. How about we practice good behavior before we commit murder?
Exactly.
So there were no ankle monitors
No
waiting.
one's calling us for judge and jury late and
I know. I get another free pass out of jury duty for the rest of my life. Be like, all right,
just listen to my
listen to the podcast. Listen to this episode 4 of the Chicago Ripper Crew, and then you tell me what I think.
Yes.
But
they'll invite you to leave.
Yep, they always do.
Yeah.
But so there were no ankle monitors waiting for him, no parole officer assigned to track his movements. The only restriction was a mandate that he register as a sex offender. For the first time since the 1980s, a member of the Ripper Crew was free.
That'll fix everything.
Yeah. The reason lay in the sentencing laws of another era. When Thomas pled guilty in 1987 to Borowski's murder, he did so under a framework that allowed day-for-day credit. Talk about a dumbass, stupid freaking law, meaning every day he served without major disciplinary issues earned him another day off his sentence.
Oh.
A 70-year term imposed under those rules was never meant to be a literal 70 years behind bars. With credit applied, it functioned much more like a 35-year sentence. And because that good time structure was the law at the time that he entered his plea, Illinois couldn't retroactively change the terms. Whatever the public thought he deserved, whatever later reforms tried to fix, none of it would apply to this total piece of shit. So by the time he crossed the 35-year threshold, the state was legally obligated to consider his sentence served. So just so we're all clear here, this dumbass bullshit, ignorant, nonsensical law doesn't mean that he's eligible for parole. It doesn't mean that he is paroled. It means he is done.
Paid his debt to society.
Sentence served. It's one of the dumbest freaking laws I've ever heard of, ever. I mean, this tops them all. Even then. So I don't know how's that freaking work. Like if you're like Delwayne Eaton and you kill your cellmate,
yeah,
and they decide not to prosecute you for it, that's just what, you didn't get a day off for that day?
Yeah. You didn't get a gold star.
So you just got to do 35 days in one day?
Yeah. Yeah. You didn't get a gold star that day.
Such a nonsensical bullshit freaking law. Even then, his release didn't happen immediately. Before Illinois could discharge him, he needed an approved residence. For months, that was the barrier keeping him behind bars. He was technically eligible to leave as early as 2017, but no acceptable housing plan existed. Not one location that satisfied mandatory supervised release requirements while also passing community safety reviews. As officials later explained, he ended up serving the equivalent of his supervised release term inside of prison because he had nowhere else to go.
Aww.
Only after placement was arranged and only after the state verified that all credits and statutory obligations had been fully met did the door finally open. On March 29th, 2019, Thomas Coco Relias was discharged with no supervisory tail left to run. Nothing.
So we have no idea what happened after that. Or do we know?
So news spread immediately, and the reaction was explosive. Lori Borowski's poor freaking family described the release as a shockwave. They had lived decades believing that the system would prevent this exact moment. At a press conference held the day that he walked free, attorney Gloria Allred stood beside members of the Borowski family, calling his release a devastating reminder of the gaps in Illinois' law. Warning that nothing legally prevented him from contacting the victims' families, Lori's relatives spoke with visible fear and anger, saying that they would now spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. For them, justice had been delivered in 1987 and completely torn out from under them in 2019 by the fine print of a statute written long before any of them imagined the consequences. The public concern wasn't theatrical. Thomas's release triggered community alerts from police departments, including Elmhurst, where Borowski had last been seen alive. Officers warned residents about his history, about the crimes attributed to the group that he had been a part of, and about the fact that he was likely the only Ripper Crew member who would ever rejoin society. For many, it reopened wounds that they assumed had scarred over decades ago. As the months passed, reporters tracked his movements across Illinois. His attempts to settle in Aurora and then in Peoria generated new waves of community resistance and public anxiety. Neighborhood meetings were held. Questions circulated about who exactly was responsible for monitoring this freaking animal. Mm-hmm. The answer, unsettling to many, was no one. His supervision term had expired while he was still incarcerated. The only legal requirement was registration. He could move, he could work, he could keep to himself, all without the oversight most people expected for someone involved in the crimes of this magnitude. By the spring of 2019, the story of Thomas Coco Relays had entered its newest and strangest phase. A former member of the Ripper Crew, free not because of a court's reassessment of guilt or because of new evidence or advancing innocent claims, but because of the sentencing mechanics in place at the time of his dumbass plea deal. Illinois didn't choose to let him go in 2019. Illinois chose to let him go in 1987. When the 70-year sentence was written into law with a clock that would run out decades later. And on March the 29th, 2019, that clock struck 0. So that's what happened. That's what happened to the son of a bitch. And, I bring up Lloyd Borowski's family because that's who he was convicted of killing, but it's the families of all of these victims. This son of a bitch was involved in who knows how many. Yeah. I think he admitted to 17 or 18. So at least 17 or 18 women. I mean, this is equivalent to turning Ted Bundy out on the street. Yeah. This is equal to releasing Richard Ramirez. I mean, it is absolutely absurd. And I don't give a shit that he's retarded and dumb. No. I don't care. This man
still did it.
Murdered and mutilated women. And we're not talking about walked up and shot somebody in the head. I mean, we're talking about torture.
Whoa. Yeah.
You don't have to be smart to have a conscience. You don't have to be smart to see a person or an animal suffering and say, this is bad and I need to stop. I need to stop whatever's causing this pain. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be a smart person to see someone or somebody crying in pain and react to want to stop that pain. That's not a question of intellect. Yeah. That's a question of humanity. Yeah. And if you don't have it, you're not human. And I don't give a shit what happens to you. Anyway.
That's like the theme tonight. Anyway.
Yeah, I've gotten on a couple soapboxes. Sorry, listeners. To understand the full horror of the Ripper Crew, you have to strip away the courtroom technicalities, the appellate rulings, the procedural battles, and confront what these men actually did. Not to who, not yet, but what. Because long before the indictments were organized by counties and dates and statutory citations, a small group of men drove through Chicago's streets at night, hunting for women. And once they found them, the brutality that followed wasn't impulsive or chaotic. It was ritualized, controlled, repeated. Their crimes formed a pattern so grotesque and so consistent that seasoned detectives, medical examiners, and prosecutors struggled to put language to it. These weren't assaults. These weren't just homicides. These were acts of torture, carried out with purpose, abductions from city sidewalks, women forced into vans, restraints, handcuffs, gags, blindfolds, sexual assaults that escalated into mutilation, amputations carried out with wires, knives, or makeshift tools, wounds turned into sites of further violation, bodies dumped like garbage in alleys, fields, cemeteries, and wooded strips along expressways. Many victims died in pain that lasted far longer than most homicide victims will ever experience. Some suffered more injuries than a coroner could count. Some were killed in ways that left seasoned pathologists shaken. Investigators would later learn that at least some of these attacks were framed within a kind of twisted pseudo-religious ritual, an atmosphere of domination created by a leader who mixed sexual sadism with mock chapel theatrics to justify what they were doing. Whether every man believed it, whether each one participated equally, doesn't matter. The result was the same. Women abducted off the street, stripped of dignity, brutalized, mutilated, and left to die alone in the dark. The cruelty was not an accident. It wasn't a momentary loss of control. It was the point. They drove around looking for prey. They targeted women who were vulnerable, marginalized, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They used vehicles modified for concealment, compartments, panels, tools kept within easy reach. They carried electrical wire, not for repairs, but for amputation. They stabbed not to kill quickly, but to inflict pain and prolong suffering. Their violence was not merely physical, it was psychological, ritualistic, and sadistic. This was brutality with a signature. Every law enforcement officer who worked this case, Chicago PD, DuPage County detectives, Cook County prosecutors, medical examiners, all would later describe a level of depravity that felt medieval. One detective said that the crime scenes looked like nightmares. One prosecutor said that the mutilations were so surgical they bordered on, quote, acts of evil performed with intention. A doctor who examined a surviving victim testified that she had lived through the injuries that should have killed her within minutes. She survived by inches. And through it all, the group continued, night after night, month after month. These weren't isolated explosions of violence. They were a series of hunts conducted across the Chicago area, often with multiple men participating. In many cases, the only physical evidence that remained was the body itself and the wounds carved into it. But the confessions, when they finally came, some detailed, some rambling, some self-serving, painted a picture of a pattern far broader and more horrifying than the number of formal charges could ever reflect. That is the truth of who the Ripper Crew was, a group of men who treated torture like ritual, who mutilated women as though it were privilege, who used fear, knives, wire, and domination as tools of pleasure, who prowled the city like predators wearing human faces. Their story is often framed by what happened in courtrooms, verdicts, pleas, appeals, reversals, sentences, releases. But before any of that, they were simply this: a pack of sadistic cowards who preyed on the vulnerable and left a trail of devastation behind them. This is the violence that we must remember before we can talk about where they are now. So when you step back from the trials, the appeals, the reversals, the pleas, and the decades of legal wrangling, you're left with a reality that still feels impossible to justify. 4 men participated in some of the most sadistic crimes in the country's history, and today their fates look nothing alike. One was executed, one is free, one, arguably the most vicious mind behind all of it, was never convicted of murder and will be eligible for parole in old age, and one sits in prison for life, spared from execution not by mercy, but by the collapse of the state's death penalty system. This is where the Ripper Crew stands now. Andrew Coco Relays is the only member the state of Illinois ever put to death. He was executed by lethal injection on St. Patty's Day. He was 35 years old. His crimes were monstrous and prosecutors argued that he was an enthusiastic participant in the group's torture mutilation rituals. But the fact remains, out of the entire crew, only one ever faced the ultimate punishment, and it wasn't the man most people believe orchestrated the violence. Edward Spreitzer, the crew's most active participant, remains in prison for the rest of his life. He sits in a cell at Pinckneyville Correctional Center, serving multiple life terms, some from his Cook County plea, one converted from his death sentence after Governor George Ryan commuted every death row case in 2003. Spreitzer once faced lethal injection for the murder of Linda Sutton. Now, because of that blanket clemency rule, his fate is sealed not by execution, but by the slow grind of life without parole. He will die behind bars. And then there is Captain Asshat himself, Robin Gecht, the supposed ringleader, the man whose house some co-defendants described as the site of mock chapel rituals, mutilations, and killings, the man whose influence prosecutors said shaped the entire crew's sadism, the one at the center of nearly every confession, the one investigators believed was the architect of the violence, and yet he was never convicted of murder, not one. A lack of physical evidence kept homicide charges off the table, and so he was tried only for the attempted murder, rape, and kidnapping of a surviving victim. He received 120 years, a massive sentence, yeah, but not a death sentence, not even a natural life sentence. And because Illinois has parole eligibility written into certain pre-truth in sentencing structures, Gecht will be eligible for release on October 10th, 2042. He will be 88 years old. If he lives that long, the alleged mastermind of one of the most depraved serial torture crews in American history could walk out of prison a free man. Yeah. Meanwhile, Thomas Coco Relaeus, the quieter asshat, the one whose statements helped shape the entire investigation, walked out of prison already. He was released on March 29th, 2019, after the state determined he had fully served a 70-year sentence under the 1980s day-for-day bullshit nonsense dumbass system. He served roughly 35 years, no ankle monitor, no active parole supervision, only the requirement that he register as a sex offender. He has since moved from Aurora to Peoria, living in ministry housing unless you found something else.
That's what I found, but it also says he must check in with Peoria Police Department quarterly, and his last check-in was August 1st, 2024.
And so instead of, well, why don't we go pick the son of a bitch up then?
Because he's not checking in.
That's the other problem that I have with this whole register as a sex offender bullshit thing, is nobody monitors it and nobody does anything about it when they don't follow the law. Oh, disgusting son of a bitch.
He moved there in May 2024 from Aurora. The ministry has described him as a kind and quiet person who works in the food service department and performs custodial duties.
Well, if they want him, they can have him. Just keep his ass there.
And why hasn't he checked in over a year?
Yeah, exactly. I got one more for you here. And orbiting all of this history is the strange footnote of David Gecht, Robin's son.
Oh, no.
Not part of the Ripper crew, but once convicted of an unrelated murder decades later, he spent years in prison before being fully exonerated in 2022, ultimately settling a civil rights lawsuit for millions. It is an odd parallel legacy. The father accused of leading one of the worst torture murder crews in the country's history, still alive in prison, the son wrongfully convicted and later freed. This is the final map of where the Ripper crew ended up. One executed, one free, one serving life because a governor erased every death sentence at once, and the alleged mastermind, the one the others continually pointed to, still alive, still incarcerated, and still eligible for parole. It is a bizarre and unsettling ending to a case defined by brutality, fear, and legal complexity. But more than anything, it's a reminder of a truth victims' families have lived with for decades. Justice, in this case, was never equal, and for some, It never felt complete at all. So when you finish tracing the arc of the Ripper Crew cases, from the first abduction to the final appeals, from the confessions to the courtroom battles, from the death chamber at Tom's to the quiet 2019 release of a man who once described ritual mutilations, you end up confronting one of the most disturbing contradictions in American criminal history. 4 men participated in acts so barbaric that even seasoned detectives struggled to describe them out loud. 4 men formed a group whose violence went beyond homicide, beyond sadism, beyond anything resembling ordinary criminal pathology. And yet, the justice system delivered 4 entirely different outcomes, from execution to freedom, with the one man believed to be the architect of the entire freaking operation escaping a single murder conviction. This case defies clean narrative resolution because everything about it bends toward the grotesque. The crimes themselves, the psychology behind them, the unevenness of the punishments, the confessions that open windows into a world almost too depraved to believe, and the fact that, after all of it, the state of Illinois never succeeded in proving a single homicide against the man so many investigators considered the gravitational center of this violence. Robin Geck stands at the core of this moral imbalance. Even now, decades later, the records feel warped by the absence of a murder conviction. Every co-defendant pointed directly at him. Every confession placed him at the ritual center of mutilations and killings. Nearly every survivor or witness encounter traced back to his van, his home, his influence. And yet, the lack of physical evidence, I guess, no recovered breasts, no prints, no DNA, no forensic anchor, let him slip through the cracks of the homicide charges. The man painted as the ringleader of a sexual sadistic torture cult was put away not for murder, but for the mutilation and attempted murder of a single survivor. It is the kind of legal irony that makes the criminal justice system feel both powerful and profoundly limited at the same time. A man accused of serial ritualistic butchery will die in prison not because the law proved the murders, but because he left one victim alive, and she had the courage to identify him. And then there's the psychology. You can't study this case without feeling the gravitational pull of the psychological darkness at its center. The crew operated not as lone wolf predators, but as a micro-cult of shared delusion, sadism, and sexual domination. Their crimes show hallmarks of group psychology gone rancid, the diffusion of responsibility, the reinforcement of violent fantasies, the escalation of cruelty that happens when no one in the room is the voice of restraint. It is the kind of group pathology seen in torture units, death squads, and other enclaves where violence becomes identity and ritual replaces conscience. The mutilations in these crimes, focused, repeated, intentional, weren't random bursts of violence. They reflected a fascination with bodily destruction that is extraordinarily rare even among serial offenders. The removal of breasts, the sexual assault of wounds, the mock religious framing described in confessions. These are not just murders. They are desecrations. They are performances of power. They are statements of who controlled life and who controls death. That level of sadism isn't born in a vacuum. It spreads. It requires an organizing force, a person who shapes the narrative, defines the rules, builds the fantasy. For investigators, that person was Gecht. For the men who confessed, that person was Gecht. For the surviving victim whose courage saved future lives, that person was Gecht. But for the law, the absence of a body tied directly to him meant the absence of murder charges. On the other end of the spectrum sits Thomas Coco Reales, a man who helped carry out the group's attacks, who confessed in chilling detail, who once described acts that no human being should ever have to put into words, and yet he is now walking free, legally unmonitored, decades after the crimes. This is the kind of outcome that makes you question the very architecture of sentencing systems and good time credit statutes. How a man connected to a serial mutilation crew can live in Peoria, Illinois today under the same legal freedoms as any released felon is something victims' families will never reconcile. Edward Spreitzer, multiple life sentences, condemned by a jury, saved by a governor's sweeping clemency order, still breathing in prison. Andrew Coco Relias executed, the only one the state ever managed to kill, and in a twist that still feels surreal, the last human being Illinois would ever put to death. 4 men, 4 outcomes, and not one of them neatly aligned with the nature or the scale of the crimes themselves. This case stands apart because it refuses to let the darkness fade into tidy categories. It forces you to confront the boundaries between the monstrosity and law, between what investigators know and what prosecutors can prove, between what is morally certain and what must be legally established. It shows how the worst crimes do not always translate into the harshest sentences, and how the most dangerous mind in a group can evade the very charge that defines the group's legacy. And most of all, it reminds us that these cases were never about the killers. They were about the women whose lives were taken, desecrated, and discarded. Women who deserve to be remembered not for the horrifying ways they were killed, but for the human lives they lived before the crew ever crossed their path. Before we turn to the victim tribute, take a moment to sit with that truth. Justice in this case was never evenly distributed. It was jagged, fragmented, and shaped as much by the limitations of evidence as by the enormity of the crimes. But the women at the center of it deserve a story that isn't defined by the men who ended their lives. And that is where we go next. Before we close this chapter, we have to turn our attention where it always should have been, toward the women whose lives were stolen, and toward those whose names may never be recovered from the shadows. Cases like this, cases where cruelty becomes ritual and violence becomes a kind of twisted creed, can pull focus toward the offenders. But what matters in the end is not the men who inflicted the harm. It's the people they hurt, the voices silenced, the stories interrupted, and the futures erased by their hands. The women targeted by the Ripper crew came from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, different stages of life. Some were young and just beginning to step into adulthood. Some were mothers carrying the weight of entire families. Some were women simply trying to survive another day in a world that already demanded too much from them. And all of them deserved a life that extended far beyond the brief and brutal intersection with 4 men who saw them not as human beings, but as vessels for their own delusions and violence. Every known victim had a name, a face, a history before the crew ever crossed their path, and nothing those men did can ever take that away. Linda Sutton had her own joys, her own struggles, her own circle of people who loved her and still grieve her all these years later. Lori Borowski was 21 years old, full of the kind of youth and ambition that should have carried her decades into the future. Shui Mock was a daughter, a sister, a young woman whose last moments should never have been defined by cruelty. Sandra Delaware was only 18. Rosebeck Davis was a professional whose life should have still been on the upward climb. Each of them mattered in ways that go far beyond the lines in a case file. Some women survived, barely, painfully, defiantly. Women like Angel York and Beverly Washington, who endured trauma so severe it would have broken most people, yet somehow found the strength to live and to speak. Because of them, police found direction in a case that could have stayed buried beneath indifference and fear. Their voices broke the silence that the crew depended on. Their courage saved future lives. Other survivors, including Cynthia Smith, and even witnesses like Alberto Rosario, carried scars that were not just physical, but permanent reminders of how quickly a life can be torn apart. They lived, but they did not walk away unchanged. And then there are those whose names never made the papers, the women known only through confessions or through bodies found in places where no one should be left, the unnamed cocktail waitress, the unidentified Hispanic woman whose injuries echoed the crew's signature mutilations, the woman Edward Spreitzer described, the one whose body was thrown into the water with bowling balls tied to her, a victim the world never got the chance to restore even with a name, and the women whose bodies were never recovered at all, lost in the margins between confessions, rumors, and investigative dead ends. These unknown victims matter every bit as much as the ones that we can name. The lack of a name does not mean the lack of a life. Each one was once a daughter, a friend, someone with a laugh, a nickname, a favorite song, someone whose story ended without ceremony, without justice, and without the world ever knowing who she was. Even the cases later ruled out, the ones that sparked suspicion but ultimately proved unrelated, remind us how widespread the fear was during this era, how easily the edges of one tragedy can blur into another when violence becomes the backdrop of a city. We honor every life touched by this case, the known and the unnamed, the confirmed and the suspected, the survivors who spoke up and the ones who never had the chance to. And we honor the possibility, the painful, heavy possibility that the real number of victims may never truly be known. Because every confession hinted at more. Every pattern suggested a broader scope. Every gap in the timeline whispered that the crew's cruelty did not begin with the first body found, nor did it end with the arrests. This tribute is not about the darkness of their last moments. It is about the light they brought into the world before the darkness ever found them. It is about the families who still carry their memory, the communities that refuse to let them be forgotten, and the truth that no amount of horror can erase a person's humanity. As we remember them now, we acknowledge the full weight of what was lost. We speak their names when we can, and we hold space for those whose names have been lost to time. We recognize that their stories deserve far more than fear and silence. They deserved safety. They deserved love. They deserved years that were stolen from them by 4 men who chose cruelty over humanity. To every woman harmed by the Ripper crew, known, unknown, named, unnamed, found, or unfound, you are remembered here. You are honored here. And as long as these stories continue to be told, the men who tried to erase you will never succeed. Your light endures, even in the shadow that you left behind. Well, what do you think over there, Angela? That's the end of this nightmare, but what are your thoughts? Yeah?
Yeah, that's just vile.
Yeah, vile.
Vile. Despicable.
I mean, I obviously had a tremendous struggle with the sentencing part and the way that it was all carried out, and the fact that one of these animals, the worst story by far, I think, the worst story that we've told yet on Dark Dialogue, as far as, and I don't mean that any of these lives were more valuable than any of the rest we've talked about. No. But the depravity that went into their deaths is far beyond anything we've talked about. And really, it's almost beyond measure.
Yeah. How do you measure it?
And the fact that one of these animals is living out there right freaking now,
doing what he wants,
just boggles the mind. And that Robin Gecht could be one day, I don't give a shit if he's 105. I don't want that animal out on the street.
No.
And I gotta say that the imbalance there is hard for me to reconcile.
It's disgusting. Yeah.
One brother was murdered by the state, and I call it murder because it is murder.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's wrong.
Right.
It's just murder.
Right.
He was murdered by the state for what he did.
Exactly.
The other brother is turned loose at the young age of 58. Yeah. That's freaking young, man. That's a lot of life left.
Hanging out at a ministry.
And then you got another one that's in prison for the rest of his freaking life. And another one that could potentially get... it is all over the map. It's completely insane. I have a really hard time reconciling that portion of it. And I don't...
It's difficult. And that's not even a strong enough word.
Yeah, it's crazy. And it's not even like in the Simon Sue case, it's not even a comparison between like the ones that actually were involved in the murders and the ones that weren't, because they were, take Robin Gecht out of it.
Yeah.
I think it's bullshit that he wasn't tried.
Exactly.
They should have tried him 17 different times.
Oh, yeah.
To see if one could stick. I don't give a shit if the jury comes back not guilty. Okay, next one up.
Yep, next, take a number.
And
there we go.
I think that they definitely could have convicted him, but take him out of the equation. You still got 3 that confessed to murder.
Yeah. How
can their sentences range from execution to release? It just is insane. I cannot reconcile it. Anyway, I ask you what you think and then I talk, so.
But you and I agree, and I don't think any different. Like,
it's just nuts.
There's nowhere to go with it that makes anybody feel any better.
No. And there's no way to make anybody feel better.
No.
Except when they announced that Thomas Coco Relays died of a heart attack or
was hit by a bus.
Or...
Sorry, did I say that out loud?
Well, you were nicer when I was going to say, because my next one was going to be, or a family member found him.
Yeah.
Dealt out their own version of justice.
Body parts of his was cut off and raped and mutilated. Come on.
Because, I got to say, if this was a family...
An eye for an eye situation here.
If this was a family member of mine, he would be a target. I'm just saying. Like, he would not be safe.
Right. They're holding a lot of restraint.
Oh, man.
That family.
Yeah.
I don't know how they're just that... I don't know where you harness that strength.
I don't either, man. I don't either. All these poor freaking families in this case. Every case that we talk about,
Yeah.
Anyway, that brings us to the end of this episode, obviously. This case, it sits heavy. There are crimes that haunt us because of what you don't know, and then there are crimes that haunt you because of what you do know. The Ripper Crew falls into that second category, a level of depravity that doesn't fade with time. A case where the brutality wasn't just incidental, it was the point. And somehow, the man who built the ideology behind it never faced a murder conviction, while the one that should have been first in line for a death sentence is still breathing, still aging behind bars, still eligible for parole one day. That imbalance is something you just don't forget.
It's just unbelievable that someone like that could avoid a murder charge entirely.
Exactly.
And disgusting.
Exactly. And at the same time, you've got one member of the crew walking free today. As a reminder, a grim one that's
so disgusting.
Yes, that justice doesn't always look how it should. The only thing we can control is how we remember the victims and how we refuse to let their stories be buried beneath the horror of this group of worthless freaking asshats that took them.
Right. So while we remember the victims, if you value the work that we do, if these deep dives matter to you, please take a moment to support the show. Like the show, follow the show, subscribe wherever you listen, rate and review the show. That 5-star rating genuinely helps push these cases into the light where they belong. Share the episode with someone who cares about true crime, victim advocacy, or understanding how cases like this are even possible.
And if you want to go deeper into this community, join the Dark Dialogue Collective, our growing work of researchers, volunteers, and people who give a damn about getting cases right. Consider participating in the Adopt a Victim program, where you can help keep unsolved and underserved cases alive. If you want to support the work directly, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or Substack. Every bit of support helps us expand the investigations, upgrade equipment, and bring more cases to life.
And remember, if you have case theories, corrections, insights, or just want to reach out, You can always email us. We read every message, and your input shapes the future of this show. And truly, thank you for being here. Cases like this are hard, and it means a lot that people care enough to listen.
It really does. And what we missed on that last one was the email is info@darkdialogue.com. And you can find everything that we just talked about, ways to support us, you can listen to all of our different shows on our network. Everything can be found on our website at www.darkdialogue.com. And until then, we're going to put a stamp in this one. Finally, I'm glad to be done with it. The next case that we have coming up, we're going to Florida for. So it's going to be, and it's a pretty intriguing one. Okay. It'll be a lot of fun. But until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep the dialogue alive.